Got it. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 35. Jesus put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. While his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servant said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.' He put another parable before them, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds. But when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.' He told them another parable. 'The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. It is like leaven that the woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened.' All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. 'I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world.'" No denying that Jesus Christ was a wonderful storyteller. He could teach straightforwardly, of course, and he did very often. But even those straight sermons, if we can call them that, are filled with wonderful word pictures to carry his words home. If you look at what we call the Sermon on the Mount, with some seriously heavy teaching in it, it still has things like this: "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." Now, as a chemist, I should frown at that, because if we're talking sodium chloride, crystallized structure there, it will always taste salty. It just is. But Jesus is using an illustration from everyday life 2,000 years ago, where salt wasn't always the 99.9% pure sodium chloride analytical reagent that I could get in the labs. You could find stuff that just still looked like salt, but all the sodium chloride had been washed out of it, leaving something insoluble behind, probably gypsum. Salt, but without the salty taste. Everybody knew about that, and how its only use nowadays would be for pavement. But to think in Jesus's word picture that people could be at some times and in some ways like self-contradictory, tasteless salt, that's designed to get the cogs whirring. And maybe we think of Jesus's parables too much as delightful little stories that so often pick up cute, quaint, everyday things in a nice, cozy way. The everyday story of country folk, but without the drama. Maybe we're too familiar with parables. Or maybe we just don't think and see how edgy and subversive they really are. Well, that's what I hope we're going to be doing over this summer break. We're starting with, I think I'd say, 2 deceptively simple, very small parables today. Just 3 verses for the 2 of them in their entirety. But Jesus's apparently simple parables contain subversive messages, correcting misunderstandings about the kingdom of heaven. They pop up right in the middle of a chapter, in the middle of Matthew's account of Jesus's life. And it's suddenly chock full of parables. The bigger ones usually get more attention. It kicks off this chapter with the famous parable of the sower. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "The sower went out to sow." Conveniently, we get an explanation of what Jesus is saying in this parable as we read on. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. And then we have another parable hard on its heels with a similar flavor, more stuff about farmers and fields. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his land, in his field. The phrase that we will hear over and over when we come to these parables is, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to. It's a fairly general introduction to quite a few of those parables. Doesn't mean to say that all those parables are making exactly the same point. Instead, it's a heads up that there's something coming up soon that will shed light from some direction or other on how God's ways of doing things in this world are usually very different from our own. The kingdom of heaven, in contrast to the way this world works, typically. So, what we see when we look at a parable should typically be designed to shake up our normal way of thinking about things. It might stretch things. It might even turn them upside down. But even a simple little parable, we must really not think is going to turn out as simple as it first appears, as we might have imagined it would be. So when we come to the first of today's little pair of parables, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. We really mustn't say to ourselves, oh, look, just another one about farmers and fields. Yes, it is using exactly the same words for sowing and seed as we've seen in the first 30 verses of that chapter. But this little parable has its own particular spin on things. It's not just a small-scale summary or rerun of what has just gone on before. There's stuff here that we need to puzzle out in its own right. So let's start by thinking about this picture that Jesus is rapidly painting for us here. And perhaps we need to deliberately distance ourselves from 21st century stuff. Not modern farming, not huge fields. That's only really possible with mechanization. We've got to think a much smaller affair. And I don't think we necessarily have to think of a small field devoid of anything else apart from this one seed planted in the middle, which grows into this one tree. I wonder if there are already other plants growing in the field that make it all the more ridiculous. You know, you've got your rhubarb, you've got your beans, you've got your everything else already planted there. One little seed like that, how is that going to fare? How could that possibly compete with all this stuff that's already there established? I think that might be part of the picture that Jesus is painting, but it's so very quick, so few words here. You haven't got any details. A lot of it we've got to imagine and try perhaps to get the traditional thinking challenged. Anyway, so neither should we totally confine ourselves to think in terms of the practicalities of farming either. Even if Jesus used the word fields here in Matthew's gospel, Luke used a word which was translated by garden, a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his garden. So I think we have to have some kind of nuance here of this is something to do with this guy's personal space as well as simply just growing crops in order to survive. And that convinces me even more that when Jesus tells this story, whichever nuance of field or garden he had in mind on any occasion, because he probably told it several times on different occasions, and maybe with slightly different slants each time. But whichever, it would ring some bells in the minds of people with a Jewish background. Because back in the Old Testament, you've got the Jewish nation being described as God's field or garden or vineyard. Classic passage in Isaiah chapter 5. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. The summary of that passage, a few verses later on, picks it all up with an all-round description that could fit garden or field or vineyard. The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his, should have put this in highlight, pleasant planting. But although Isaiah uses this lovely phrase, pleasant planting, his 5th chapter is not a very pleasant prophecy. There's something seriously wrong with this vineyard. It isn't yielding what it was planted in order to yield. And despite all the efforts that God has put into it, Isaiah 5:2, he dug it, cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice vines. He put a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. Actually, people can be a bit slow with imagery, maybe imagery like that. The church our daughter Jo has been part of, a few years ago, launched a church plant. They thought they should contact their church insurers to make sure this new venture was adequately covered. The insurers wrote back about their agricultural project in the next town. And so Isaiah interprets his vision as well. He makes it clear what he's talking about when he says wild grapes. And here it is. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold, an outcry. It's the ungodly behavior of God's people that Isaiah is taking issue with. Jesus actually said quite specifically on another occasion, following up another parable explicitly featuring a vineyard, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. But here, earlier in Matthew's account, I wonder if what Jesus says merely hints along those lines. In this garden or field, what does this man now plant? But another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. Why ever a mustard seed? Well, first of all, you might think, what does it matter? It's only tiny. It is the smallest of all seeds. But there are going to be huge consequences to this in time. When it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Now, according to Google Images, that is a mustard tree. And you never know, they might even be right. But you get the picture, don't you? Look, that picture says there are going to be huge consequences for the rest of this field. The other plants are going to be overshadowed at best. And as birds, folks, how many of you are gardeners here? Some of us might think initially it's wonderful to have birds in your garden. We've got a bird table and we reasonably regularly put some food out on it for them, and it's great to watch. But what if you're wanting to grow fruit in your garden? Birds are not always the best news in those circumstances. You might find you have to put up netting to keep your soft fruit from being pecked to oblivion. Or think seagulls in Cornwall, not just viciously stealing food, but capable of not really respecting your car if you park it in the wrong place. So folks, when we see in our mind's eye here this image of the birds coming to roost in the trees in Jesus's parable, don't think the hearers are necessarily all going to go dewy-eyed and soppy. This isn't necessarily a romantic idea like warm sunset over quiet seas. And I think I see Jesus possibly hinting here A reminder that the Jewish nation, like tenant farmers, are in danger of eviction. And look at what Jesus is hinting might come to fill their place. Something small at present, something currently insignificant, but something that's going to grow and grow and grow. Something that people are not necessarily going to be all happy about, like blackbirds coming to gobble up your raspberries. Perhaps I'm wondering if Jesus is hinting here about a time coming when the Gentiles are going to be invited to take root in God's specifically prepared field. Foreigners, non-Jews, are going to be called to come to the banquet. You see, that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's about wonderful grace to people who don't deserve it. And I think Jesus must be implying here, there will be people who find this objectionable. There will be people complaining about it. Let's think about that in our own context here. I know there's some of you here who don't think you are worthy to be here. You're wondering whether you haven't slipped up in some way. And normally, if you feel this way, it's in some vague way you can't properly put your finger on. But you just have this nagging feeling that God really doesn't very much want to have you around. He just puts up with you. But look, here in this parable, can't we see some kind of hint that God himself is planting something that doesn't really belong in a proper field? It's a Gentile seed growing in Jewish soil, but it is growing and growing and growing, and it is going to keep on growing and thriving. And Jesus seems delighted with the outcome here, as those pesky, unworthy Gentile birds come and perch and nest in the branches. Those down at ground level, yeah, there are some of those around as well. Folks, you might not like to hear this, but I think you need to. Sometimes we hear things which are far from gracious. It doesn't often get said out loud because we know how terrible it sounds, but I sometimes have heard this. I've heard, we don't want people like that here in this church. There's twice I distinctly remember hearing it. Once was at a church in the area where I've been invited to preach, and I've heard it spoken here in this building once as well. And folks, listen up. It's far too easy to lapse into thinking that this church is about us and what we want, what we feel cozy with, and we feel a right not to be disturbed, what we've become accustomed to over the years. Now, actually, I'm aware I need to be saying this to myself now, as I've come back from 3 months of sabbatical and find that people might actually have been wanting and enjoying things being done differently. Different from the comfortable routine that I've settled into over years here in the pulpit. Because let's face what Jesus is saying here in this little parable. It's actually not such a cozy farmyard parable after all. It's a challenge to some of us to believe that we are invited to be a welcomed guest in God's field. And it's a challenge to others to accept that the church, as I once heard it described, is the only society on earth that is run for the primary benefit of those who are currently non-members. It's a subversive little parable, really. And the next one is even shorter, but I think it's very, very similar in that way. Listen up briefly. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. So we moved indoors now, from the farmyard to the kitchen. And first of all, it seems entirely normal stuff, something scarcely worth commenting on. Because maybe you've used a bread maker and you've measured in the appropriate amount of dry yeast. And you press the button and away it buzzes and whirs. It stirs the bread mixture around on that hook. You leave it to stand and it sort of clucks to itself and the dough slowly rises before the actual bake. So what's so noteworthy about this that Jesus converts it into a worthwhile parable to tell? What I think this is probably getting at, what makes it so barbed and subversive, is that yeast or leaven, just about every other time you get it in the Bible, has a fairly negative connotation. Go back into the Old Testament, the setup of the Passover. Maybe that's where it starts. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses, for if anyone eats what is leavened, from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Come over into the New Testament, and you'll find some clearly negative vibes about leaven. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Your boasting is not good, says Paul to the church. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Leaven in the sense of contaminates. Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. This Jesus is warning about the teachings and attitudes of the Pharisees. Then they understood that Jesus did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So I reckon that here, when Jesus talks about leaven or yeast or whatever you want to call it, we've got to read something a bit negative into what he's saying. So the growth that Jesus is talking about here is something natural. We need to see a darker side to it. Somebody somewhere is going to be seeing this growth, I reckon, as maybe threatening and unwelcome. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. So if Paul will pick up the notion of unleavened bread as something pure and wholesome, wouldn't that mean that here, back in Jesus's parable in Matthew 13, there's going to be somebody saying that there is something improper or evil or indecent going on in this process? Folks, do you think, therefore, that this is telling precisely the same story as the slightly longer parable just in front of it? Which is why the two of them occur together here. Could this be, once again, the people who feel themselves to have the right to be the people of God, the only people of God, react against this contamination of Gentileness into their pure, wholesome, yeast-free flour? So look around you, maybe on the sly, when we come to break bread in just a few minutes' time. Do you feel that maybe someone is looking at you, or thinking at you, at least, and saying inwardly, I'm not sure they really belong here? You feel as if you're some kind of leaven contaminating the loaf. You feel as if you might be some unwelcome bird, some pesky seagull, some feathered rat, being eyed suspiciously by the guide. But folks, remember that this is what Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like. This is God's way of doing things differently. You come not because you are worthy, but because you are invited. The Pharisees' proud denunciation is worn by Jesus as a badge of honor. The Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. And yes, he does. And he forgives us when we repent. And he cleanses us if we will stop insisting that we're clean enough already. And he gives us new life if we will only face up to the fact that we are dead in our trespasses and sins. So I'm going to dare to finish with part of what might be called a bidding prayer in a different kind of church. But it's gospel truth. It's totally in line with these couple of little parables in which Jesus has given us hints of heaven. Come to this table in a few minutes' time after we've sung our final hymn. Come to this table not because you must, but because you may. Come not because you are strong, but because you are weak. Come not because any goodness of your own gives you the right, but because you need mercy and help. Come because you love the Lord a little and would like to love him more. Come because he loved you and gave himself for you. Come, meet the risen Christ in the breaking of bread. Let's pray, shall we?